There's no question there's a ton of economic literature that looks at rent control, different places all around the country, in New York, the history of rent control in Cambridge, in Boston. There's a lot of research in California and other parts of the country, as well as internationally, and invariably the research focuses on two of these three buckets here. The incentives that are created for conversion property. We were talking earlier, before the session started, about the challenges owners are facing in terms of the way their potential returns or their actual returns are reduced by rent control rules, and the way that pushes people to want to shift themselves in the use of their property in a way, strategically, in a way that makes more sense, whether it be co-op conversions or other ways to convert out away from rental in order to find more profitable uses of the property. So there's a lot of evidence on that. There's also a lot of evidence on sort of thinking about a negative supply impact of misallocating housing or an inefficient housing market, which is a very economics type term. But essentially what it's trying to say is people don't end up living in the right type of housing. Rent control keeps you, there's certainly a benefit to those people that get a reduced rent. There's cost to the other people who don't benefit from it. People often feel stuck in their unit and unable to move to a different unit because they wouldn't be able to achieve the rent they would want. And so it creates an inefficiency where you end up living in a unit that might be too big, too small. That doesn't work for you. There's a lot of research on that area. Where there isn't a lot of research is on the topic of new development and what it truly means. And it's hard to figure out ways to do that. And that was what the challenge that we wanted to do. And in particular, there were a couple of things that we knew in terms of theoretical research, that rent control policies that don't exempt newer buildings, rent control policies that allow for local changes to happen frequently, create areas of concern and uncertainty for the industry. But really, there was a need for empirical research, and that was what we were looking to do. We tried to account, which we generally tried to account for all the other factors. And even after doing that, we see that those rent-controlled cities, the housing supply grew a lot faster, significantly faster. And after the rules changed. The second thing is that these results are pretty impressive when you think about that, what I was saying earlier about the Berkeley example. Construction, they actually had rent control on units before 1980. So if I was building in 1988 or 1992, technically speaking, my building was not covered by rent control, and yet people didn't build. And a lot of that was the lack of certainty, the lack of stability, and that's what sort of we conclude that was a big factor in determining why people didn't want to build and didn't feel comfortable building, because they knew that those rules could change at any point in time, and suddenly retroactively you finish building your building and it could be subject to rent control. And lastly, I do want to kind of go back and emphasize some of those things, when we're thinking about those particularly negative effects. Now, there were a group of rule changes that happened at the same time, and there's not really any way to separate those. But vacancy decontrol, having a stable and consistent date for exemptions on single family and condo units, and limitations on how local jurisdictions could shift the rules, having a stable environment, all seem to have made a big difference in terms of unlocking or allowing for greater supply. And we think we hope that those will provide helpful lessons for communities in terms of sort of what not to do, or in terms of how to go about mitigating the negative effects of rent control. If you are going to have rent control policies, these are sort of things to avoid if you want to be able to have supply in the community.
The level of economic education in the general population is not good enough. People, even though that argument seems like just very simple and straightforward to me, some people don't believe it or don't get it, or maybe don't want to get it. So rather than taking them through a theoretic argument like that, it will be helpful in some cases to be able to say, well, look, here was rent control in a place in California. You eased the rent control slightly and you got 11,000 more housing units built because of that. So I think in that, just being able to, make a general statement like that and use this as evidence to support that will be helpful.